I run grandchildren around every day, and it really is expensive now. It's just going up, and we've got no control over it, have we? Not really.
Yeah, we've got 2 cars. We must be spending, say, $120 a week.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking about, a hybrid vehicle, so a Toyota Prius or something like that.
The precipitous rise in petrol prices is a global phenomenon. In Europe, they're far higher than they are here. Londoners are paying 90 pence a litre, around $2.20 Australian.
Price of petrol is disgusting. Absolutely disgusting, yes.
The causes are global too. There are many. But none of them is that the world is running out of oil. At least, not yet.
At the end of the day, you know, we're still suffering, aren't we?
It's terrible. I was in America last couple of weeks ago, and they're moaning about paying $3 for a gallon, so, yeah, it's very expensive over here.
$3 a gallon equates to just over $1 Australian per litre. But in a nation where cheap fuel is considered a birthright, it's a price that hurts. In Houston, Texas, oil capital of the United States, gargantuan SUVs and pickup trucks far outnumber 4-cylinder passenger cars.
It's outrageous. It really is. Yeah, well, I need a big car. I'm a big man, so I need a big car.
I done got so mad at it. You ever got so mad at something you just can't even talk on it no more?
$60 just to fill a little jet ski like this up.
Drive it around for the day. That's it.
Yep. It's out of control.
What do I got to do over here?
You any idea why it's so high?
No, not really. To be honest with you, I think it's ridiculous. There's plenty of spots in the U.S. where we can drill and get our own oil instead of getting oil from overseas. And it's bullshit. Well, excuse my French, guys.
Many Americans seem to believe that it's their dependence on imported oil that's the problem. Others blame gougers and speculators for driving up the price.
July's over at 55, no 59 in July. Your high July will be 55.
And indeed, as the price of oil has soared from under 30 to over $70 a barrel in just 2 years, the hedge funds and the traders have moved in. This is NYMEX, the New York Mercantile Exchange, the most important single marketplace for crude oil in the world. The deals made here more than anywhere else determine the global price of oil. Ray Carbone is a veteran trader of crude oil futures and options.
It's a zero-sum game. Somebody wins, that means someone's lost.
The dealer's clients might be oil companies and airlines trying to lock in costs far into the future, or banks and hedge funds trying to make a buck next week. That hot money can drive the price up or down day by day. But Carbone insists that the real-world fundamentals of supply, demand and risk determine the long-term price.
What is the main reason, do you think, that the price of oil is now double what it was 3 years ago?
If I had to choose one reason, I would look at the demand side of the equation, and on that demand side of the equation are 3 billion new consumers that are real players in the marketplace that were not players 3 to 5 years ago, and that's the Chinese and the Indians.
"13 years ago, China was a net oil exporter. Now, as its GDP leaps by 9% per year, it's become the second biggest importer of crude oil in the world, trailing only the United States. The surging demand from the developing giants of East and South Asia is testing the capacity of the global industry. There was underinvestment in the 90s when oil was cheap. Now there aren't enough oil wells, there aren't enough tankers, there aren't enough refineries. To make matters worse, many of the world's most important oil producers are in actual or potential political turmoil.
Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, Venezuela, Bolivia, Russia, well, everybody has that in mind.
These above-ground factors, says the Paris-based International Energy Agency, are driving the price up, not a shortage of oil in the ground.
The market is afraid that in case of a supply disruption, there will not be enough capacity to overcome it, to produce enough oil and enough product to cope with the supply disruption anywhere. That's the reason why prices are so high.
In fact, oil prices in the past few years have far outstripped the IEA's predictions. In Washington, too, there are red faces. The Energy Information Administration in the US Department of Energy marshals global statistics to forecast the price of energy. Just a year ago, it was predicting that crude oil would soon be back to $30 a barrel. Now it, like the IEA, forecasts that $50 is as low as the price will go. The American agency puts the blame for its error on a lack of investment, not a lack of oil.
Mainly because we aren't seeing the investment made to bring forth productive capacity from the resources that we believe are there. And that's largely in OPEC member countries, where we thought there'd be more investment made. For one reason or another, investment is slower than we thought.
The fact that the official agencies got their forecasts so wrong is not encouraging, especially when a growing chorus of oil engineers and resource scientists warn that we ain't seen nothing yet. Demand, they say, is about to outstrip supply of the world's most important commodity. The village of Ballydehob, at the southwestern tip of Ireland, is where petroleum geologist Colin Campbell has ended up after a lifetime roaming the world, from Bolivia to Papua New Guinea, Illinois to Norway. It was while he was working for Norway's Statoil, he tells me, that he first became interested in the concept of peak oil. He likes to explain the basics over a pint or three of Murphy's Stout.
We could think about this glass here, compare it with the North Sea back in the 60s. Here was a new area just full of black, beautiful liquid, just marvelous.
Now the North Sea's oil is half gone. But unlike a glass of stout, Dr. Campbell explains, the second half of an oil field is much harder and slower to consume than the first.
Eventually, it's the immutable physics of the reservoir. The pressure is falling. It isn't a single, simple pool of oil in the ground. It's complex conditions. We tap smaller and smaller parts of fields. It's difficult. It's slow. I stress slow. It just doesn't pour out of the ground at 50,000 barrels a day.
In its day, the technology which enabled Britain and Norway to find and exploit the massive oil and gas fields beneath the stormy North Sea was hailed as little short of miraculous. But Britain's North Sea oil bonanza is almost over. Thanks to the North Sea, it became a net oil exporter in 1981. Just 7 years ago, in 1999, its oil production peaked at 4.5 million barrels per day. By last year, production had slumped to a mere 1.5 million barrels per day, 14% less than the year before and less than Britain's daily consumption. The rise and fall of Britain's North Sea oil produces a curve which is echoed, Colin Campbell argues, by oil province after oil province around the world.
Every oil field has an individual profile of it's found, it eventually ends, it has a peak or plateau in between. And when you add up all the individual fields, naturally that gives a corresponding pattern for the country or region and eventually the world as a whole. The way to study this is to look at every individual country and every individual field and put them together, which I in fact have done.
United States land-based production peaked way back in 1972. The discovery of Alaska's giant Prudhoe Bay field reversed the decline briefly. But despite all America's technology, the curve has proceeded downwards. Country after country has followed a similar path. Russia, Venezuela, Indonesia. According to Chevron, in 33 of the world's 48 most important oil-producing countries, production has already peaked. Australia's peak crude oil production was passed in 2000. Campbell's gloomy prediction is that peak global production of cheap conventional oil may have already passed. If oil from deep water and the polar regions and liquids derived from gas are added, production will peak soon after 2010. Production, says Campbell, follows the path of discovery, and discovery of new oil peaked 40 years ago.
The discovery of oil has been falling ever since, relentlessly, and it's been falling despite a worldwide search, always aimed at the biggest and best prospects. No one's looking for the smallest and the worst, the biggest and the best. It's been falling despite amazing technological and geological advances. We understand this business so much more than we did. And I think there is no good reason to expect this downward trend to change direction.
As Dr. Campbell tells audiences in a lecture he delivers all over Europe, as discovery has trended down in the past 50 years, consumption has kept on rising. The last year in which the world discovered more new oil than it used was 1981.
So if we put it all together, this gives a valid, genuine picture without arguing endlessly whether the peak is this year, last year, 2010, or whenever. What matters, and matters really very seriously, is the vision of the long decline that comes into sight on the other side of peak. That's really what matters, and that's really what we're talking about today.
Through the 90s, with crude oil prices at historic lows, Colin Campbell's prophecies of doom received little attention. But he now has influential allies all over the world. In London, for example, there's the editor of Petroleum Review, an influential journal published by the UK Energy Institute. Chris Grabowski has done his own survey of every major oil project in the world. His conclusions are bleak.
The work I do, obviously, is based on publicly available data, and we're looking with some accuracy forward about 6 years. So out to 2012, we can be fairly confident that we've got an idea of what's going on. And the answer there is that supply and demand remain pretty tight to about 2010, and after 2010, it really starts looking rather difficult. They don't add up very well.
Are you saying that, as far as you can see from the figures that you look at and the projects that you look at, that supply will actually start to decline from around 2011?
Yes.
Peak oil, in other words?
Yes.
And this really is the launch of Aspo Island.
In 2000, Colin Campbell and like-minded European scientists launched ASPO, the Association for the Study of Peak Oil.
And it looks as if Aspo Island can act as the secretariat for this world group that is forming and putting...
ASPO now has a flourishing presence in cyberspace and active branches in a dozen countries, including Australia. A nation whose principal foreign exchange earner, tourism, is dependent on long-distance air travel, says ASPO, needs to pay attention to peak oil. The state member of Parliament for Hervey Bay on Queensland's Sunshine Coast is the national patron of ASPO Australia. Andrew McNamara is one of the few politicians, state or federal, to take peak oil seriously.
I have no doubt whatsoever that over the next 10 to 15 years we will see a peak in world oil production. We will see the price rises really start to ramp up so that we look back to the good old days when petrol was only $1.40 a litre.
The effect on his own electorate, says McNamara, could be dramatic. The Hervey Bay Council recently expanded the local airport so that jets could land direct from the capital cities in the south.
And we have now 100,000 people a year flying in direct from Sydney. But again, that's built on cheap airfares, and as most people know, a lot of the cheap airlines around the world are really struggling because of the rise in the price of aviation fuel.
And those who don't come to Hervey Bay by air come by road. often in gas-guzzling four-wheel drives. The rail link from Brisbane was removed years ago.
Hervey Bay was once 4 sleepy little fishing villages. That could easily be our future again if we don't work out how are we going to get people here in 10 years' time and 15 years' time, when we now can confidently expect that the cost of conventional travel by jet and car becomes much more expensive.
The Beattie government has clearly decided it would rather have McNamara inside the tent. He's now heading up an oil vulnerability task force, which is due to report in a few weeks' time.
Pubs and stuff coming in.
But most governments, territory, state and federal, have so far ignored peak oil. That's partly because their official advice is reassuring. In Canberra, the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economics, ABARE, has consistently forecast in recent years that oil prices are about to fall.
How do you account for the fact that ABARE keeps on suggesting that the oil price will gently recede from its current value when that is so far removed from the reality?
Madam Chair, there's no doubt that I've made the occasional mistake with my oil price forecast and quite a few other forecasts, frankly.
Backbenchers on both sides of the political fence are becoming sceptical.
Does ABARE agree with geoscience in terms of when we're going to reach the crossover point between production and demand? I mean, are we...
A Senate committee, chaired by Western Australian Green Senator Rachel Seward, is due to report on global oil supply by September.
Has Australia commissioned any such research? Is anybody aware of that? In looking at the potential impact of peak oil and whether peak oil is a reality?
Madam Chair, well, nobody's asked ABARE to do such work.
Okay. ABARE insists that there's no need for panic or for government intervention.
Our view basically is that all of this material is out there. Every agent in the marketplace has access to that information, and as a consequence of that, the market will deal with this.
ABARE's confidence in the market is shared by its equivalent agencies overseas.
By December of 1949, Caltex Pacific was again ready to start drilling in Sumatra.
But even they admit that at least outside the Middle East, the era of cheap oil, oil that flowed abundantly from wells all over the world at a cost to its producers of $3 or $4 a barrel, is almost over.
Oh, we would agree with that. You know, the low-cost, high reserve finds, that era's probably over.
I think that this oil probably is not far from peaking. I agree with that. Now, if you take all the oil which is not of easy access today because very deep offshore, or oil in the Arctic Ocean, I think that there is still plenty of oil to be discovered, and we have to keep in mind that technical progress makes extraordinary results.
The technology is certainly impressive. This is the Noble Thorold Martin, one of 62 marine drilling rigs and ships owned by the Noble Corporation of Texas and deployed all over the world. The Thorold Martin is drilling an exploratory well 200 kilometers out in the Gulf of Mexico. It looks and feels as solid as an island, but in fact it's floating on giant submerged pontoons anchored to the seafloor 3,500 feet or more than a kilometer below the surface. 10 years ago, drilling in such depths was impossible. By today's standards, says Noble's CEO, it's almost shallow water.
Deep water a decade ago was 1,000 feet. People used to think 1,000 feet would never be passed. We've drilled a well recently at 9,000 feet of water. We've got rigs that are designed for 10,000 feet of water, which is about 3.2 kilometers, something of that nature.
The precision of modern rigs is extraordinary. Starting at the seabed 3 kilometers down, the drill bit can be guided through a further 10 kilometers of rock, gradually changing direction until it's traveling horizontally. It's aimed at a sweet spot in a reservoir that's been mapped by three-dimensional seismic surveys. The target may be no more than a couple of meters square. But all this technology comes at a cost. My guide on the Noble Thorold Martin was the man after whom it was named, Senior Noble Executive and lifelong oil man Thorold Martin. He manages all Noble's deepwater rigs in the Gulf.
You can take a land rig, the whole land rig total may cost you $10 million. One single piece of equipment on a semi could cost you more than a total land rig can. The cranes that you see on the rig, these cranes are $2 million a piece to operate them.
A rig like the Thorold Martin would cost $500 million to build. All this expense is passed on to the oil companies that hire the rigs and ultimately to the customer at the petrol bowser. So what are your customers having to pay per day?
Well, they have to pay for our increased investment. Day rates range from $300,000 to $600,000 per day.
So if they drill a dry hole, that's a very expensive exercise.
It is indeed, and that's why high oil prices will have to stay in place for a while because of the cost involved in drilling for that product.
Thorold Martin assured me that in the world's deep waters, he believes there are vast reservoirs of oil waiting to be found. But his boss, James Day, is not so optimistic.
The people that I trust and believe, geophysicists, geologists, say the days of the big fields are gone.
Only a tiny proportion of the deep ocean floors are thought to cover substantial reservoirs of oil, mainly on the fringes of the South Atlantic and in the Gulf of Mexico.
While we can drill off West Africa and they have significant reserves, or Brazil, or the deepwater U.S. Gulf, they're just going to be replacing what we're currently consuming. But that's just treading water. That assumes that we're not increasing consumption.
But according to the optimists, high oil prices will simply encourage the market to provide other solutions. At the Senate hearings in Canberra last month, Dr. Fisher of ABARE was positively jovial.
If the price of eggs is high enough, even the roosters will start to lay. Okay, so on the supply side, clearly high oil prices encourages lots of activity in the exploration sector and drives new technology. We would also have an enormous incentive to introduce non-conventional oil and other sources of liquid fuel. So, for example,
the biggest known source of so-called unconventional oil is the vast tar sands of Canada. Stretching in patches across northern Alberta, they cover twice the area of Tasmania. They're heavily impregnated with bitumen. In crude oil equivalent, recoverable reserves are estimated to match those of Saudi Arabia. But at a price, not just in dollars, but in energy too. The sand must be dug out and carted away by gigantic machines. The bitumen separated in vats of water and solvents, heated by natural gas, washed with more reservoirs full of fresh water, and then refined to produce a synthetic crude oil for export to an energy-hungry world.
It's clearly expensive, and of course they're trying to lower costs. They have all the incentive in the world to do that and to use less natural gas. So I think, yes, we're concerned about it, and we're looking at it from the economics point of view to be able to project how much oil sands can contribute to this growing demand for global oil.
As long as the global oil price stays high, there are big profits to be made in Alberta. Current output of Syncrude is around 1 million barrels a day. By 2016, thanks to some $12 billion of new investment by Canadian and global energy companies, it'll be up to 3 million barrels a day. But the world by then will be consuming 115 million barrels of oil every day. Australia has no tar sands. It does have natural gas, which can be compressed to make liquid fuel. and it does have almost limitless supplies of coal. As the ever-optimistic Dr. Fisher pointed out to the Senate committee,
if you move beyond oil, you can probably liquefy coal at $40 US a barrel. And there's quite a bit of coal around.
the technology to turn coal into liquid fuel certainly exists. But like the processing of tar sands, coal liquefaction would produce vastly more greenhouse gas than the extraction and refining of conventional oil. The Canadian government is a signatory of Kyoto. Even Australia might soon have to put a dollar cost on greenhouse emissions.
Any additions to, for instance, carbon taxes or carbon restrictions in any way would change the picture substantially, because it changes the cost structure, changes the ability of investors to go down a certain route.
And then there are the biofuels. Ethanol and biodiesel, made from the crops Australians already grow, or crops they could plant where none grow today.
Sugarcane, corn, grain sorghum, all those are possibilities.
At a recent ethanol conference in Brisbane, we met enthusiasts who believe that ethanol could insulate Australia from the world's coming oil shortage, if only it thinks big enough. People like expatriate American turned Aussie ethanol entrepreneur Bill Wells.
If you take the amount of agricultural products that can be easily converted to ethanol that departs our shore, that means nobody else wanted it in Australia. It's bound for export. I'm talking about barley, corn, sorghum, sugar, and wheat. If, as a matter of public policy, we decided we're going to convert that to ethanol instead, just those 4 or 5 crops that are exported would give us 7 billion liters of ethanol against a 20 billion liter petrol market overall.
But that's hardly likely to happen. According to the head of Premier Beattie's new Oil Vulnerability Task Force, ethanol can make only a marginal difference.
Ethanol will absolutely be part of the answer, as will biofuels, as will other non-conventional sources, as will more exploration for conventional oil and gas. But in the end, all of those things won't make up the shortfall that we're headed for in production of oil. There is no silver bullet. The answers to dealing with peak oil are about using less fuel and about laying out our cities in such ways that we don't need to use cars the way we have.
Already, as prices have soared, consumers are changing their habits, buying fewer large cars, lining up to buy hybrids. But changing the layout of the typical Australian or American city, constructed entirely around the use of the private car, is a project for at least a generation. And that's time we may not have.
The cars are there, the planes are there, the trains are there. You simply cannot change all of that overnight. You've got to have some time to be able to transition to better things. And by the way, every option has got problems. There are disadvantages to nuclear, there are disadvantages to coal, there's disadvantages to natural gas, there are severe disadvantages to biomass, and until we straighten that out and decide what we want to do longer term, we've got to stay alive.
Robert Hirsch lives in the respectable town of Alexandria, across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. He's a respectable man, an eminent consultant who was commissioned by the U.S. Department of Energy to write a report on how to mitigate the possible effects of peak oil. The more he looked at the problem, Hirsch told me, the more alarmed he became. It may be 30 years before peak oil confronts the world, or it may be happening now.
The worst case is that it's occurring now or very soon because the world is unprepared. It's absolutely unprepared. There are no quick fixes in something like this.
Robert Hirsch points out that while private enterprise is going flat out to develop the tar sands of Alberta, There is no full-scale coal liquefaction plant anywhere outside South Africa. Massive undertakings like this, even if the technology is known, take a decade to plan and develop.
There's just no question. We looked at crash programs in everything that made sense that's ready to go now, and it still takes 20 years to have a large impact. If you're an optimist, and I consider myself an optimist, then you want to think that everything's going to be fine. I want to think things are going to be fine. But if you're a realist and you think about the risks of being wrong, the downsides are enormous. If we get this wrong, we are all in very serious trouble.
What sort of trouble?
Well, if you look at what happened in 1973 and 1979, we had recessions, we had large unemployment, we had inflation, we had very serious economic problems, and those were brief interruptions. The peaking of world oil production will not be brief. And it can be like the Depression in the 1930s. We didn't cease to exist at that point, but the pain was terrible for a long time.
There was only one place we visited where no one complained about the price of petrol. In Kuwait, it's just 30 cents a litre.
And here it's very nice. Yeah. It's not too much hot, just normal.
Whether oil production is reaching a short peak or a long plateau depends crucially on the oil producers of the Arabian Gulf, the only ones who, at least in theory, still have ample proven reserves in the ground. Moored to an offshore pumping station supplied by pipelines laid across the seabed from the oil fields of Kuwait, this massive tanker is taking aboard 2 million barrels of crude oil. That's enough to supply Australia's total oil needs for 3 days. But it's less than a single day's production for Kuwait. Everyone agrees that if the price of oil is to be kept within bounds for the next 20 years, the Gulf producers will have to massively increase their current output.
Definitely, the Gulf states will contribute by far the largest share of the increase in our outlook over the next 20 to 25 years. We've got more than 30 million barrels a day of growth in world oil demand, and about 10 of that will be this unconventional liquids, oil sands, etc. But the majority of the rest of the growth will be from the Gulf countries.
Right through the Gulf, there's frenetic construction of new facilities. New wells, new holding tanks, water injection plants, refineries. It's stretching the global industry to its limits. But try as they might, can the Gulf producers come up with an extra 20 million barrels of oil per day in 10 or 15 years' time? There's increasing doubt that they can. Kuwait currently produces about 2.5 million barrels per day. Is it true that Kuwait hopes to be able to produce up to 4 million barrels within the next 10 years? Is that your target?
Yes, it's true. That's our target. The challenge is and the time available, you know. We have to be very aggressive. And that goes the same thing to other Gulf countries. I believe it's true, yes, we will have enough oil to meet the future demand. It's going to be very costly.
It's never been costly in the past. British geologists first surveyed the Kuwaiti desert in the 1930s. The result was the discovery of the Burgan oil field, the second most prolific in the world. Since the valves were opened in 1946, oil has been flowing freely from its wells under its own pressure at extraordinary rates. But 60 years later, Burgan is past its peak.
The early wells in Burgan were about, one well would produce 15,000 barrels per day. That same well today would produce 1,500 barrels a day. So you have to drill new wells, horizontal wells, and just, drill more wells.
To prolong its life, the Kuwait Oil Company now holds Burgan's output at a level well below what it produced at its peak. Older oil fields, its CEO admits, need costly nurturing.
They would need to be taken care of, maybe convert naturally flowing wells into artificial lifts. That would require, installation of pumps. So the cost per barrel is going to increase. Where it used to be very cheap producing these reservoirs, it could be very expensive to produce them in the future.
Even if the mature giants like Burgan are fading, Mr. Al-Zanki maintains Kuwait has ample undeveloped reservoirs which can help satisfy the world's increasing appetite.
Today, we're not one field dependent. Today, we have numerous fields that are on production. And also in the future, we will have to develop other fields, other reservoirs, In the northern part, we've been very successful in exploring the deep horizon, and it's giving us great production capabilities or good reserves.
But the reservoirs in northern Kuwait are not like the prolific supergiant fields to the south. They're much deeper underground. They're oil created in an earlier geological era.
The reservoirs down there are very patchy. They're much different from the prime stuff above. But overall, the prime big ones have been found long ago. The prime big ones produce the most. And scratching around, adding these small little bits won't really keep up production to any significant degree.
If Kuwait's reserves are a mystery, Saudi Arabia's, across the desert there to the south, are still more so. The Saudis produce over 9 million barrels of oil every day, 4 times more than Kuwait, and 10% of what the world consumes. But it's a hard place to get into, and those who manage it, oil experts and journalists, find it harder still to get information they can rely on. Ever since the Saudis expelled the international oil companies in the late 1970s and nationalized the monopoly producer, Saudi Aramco, they've guarded their oil secrets closely. TV crews are seldom admitted. We bought these pictures from the Arabic network Al Arabiya. The Saudis claim to have 260 billion barrels under the ground, a quarter of the world's known reserves. Despite all the oil they pumped in the meantime, that figure's stayed the same for almost 2 decades. Though hundreds of oil fields have been discovered in Saudi Arabia, 2 supergiant fields, Garwa and Safaniya, have been the mainstay of Saudi production for almost 70 years. It's hard to know what they're producing now. Yet if supply is to keep pace with global demand, Saudi Arabia's capacity is crucial. The optimists count on a doubling of Saudi production by 2020. The Saudi oil minister has insisted publicly and repeatedly that his country will deliver.
On this point, I want to be clear, ladies and gentlemen. We have more than sufficient reserves to increase production capacity and are committed to do so in line with demand growth. We believe that Saudi Arabia could produce at substantially higher levels for the next 50 years.
Now, that's absolute rubbish. You cannot possibly believe such statements. It's absolutely beyond belief.
Basically, what they're asking us to do is to trust them. And frankly, on something that's the lifeblood of our civilization and the way we live, to trust somebody who won't allow any audits is extremely risky. I personally don't believe the numbers that are out there.
I think His Excellency, the Minister of Petroleum, has said that we will meet demand as it materializes.
No senior executive of Saudi Aramco, even one recently retired, will publicly contradict his own government. But Sadat al-Husseini, who was for many years head of Saudi Aramco's exploration division, admits that making good on the minister's promises won't be easy. Saudi Arabia is no exception to a global problem.
The easy oil has already been produced. The remaining reserves, as significant and substantial as they are going to be more expensive and gradually more demanding to produce. Therefore, the future capacity is slower to come on stream than what has been the traditional past.
Sadat al-Husseini agrees with Robert Hirsch that the time for consuming nations to start worrying is now.
Well, I think in many of the major consuming countries, the leadership has been asleep on the watch. Everybody in the industry realizes that oil and gas are the backbone of global economies. Somehow, I guess politicians felt that this was not going to be an issue on their watch, that it was too far into the future, and therefore didn't pay attention to it.
The biggest game in Los Angeles today was Find the Gas. 3 out of 4 stations were closed. 99 out of 100 will be closed tomorrow. Monday is anybody's
Back
guess.
in the early 1970s, when drivers queued at the petrol pumps throughout the Western world, influential voices were prophesying the imminent end of the age of oil.
It's not likely California can avoid rationing much.
Governments and oil companies today point out that it didn't happen then and it won't happen now. But the doom-mongers are unabashed about crying wolf once more.
Well, the wolf did finally eat the boy.
It's not that this data is secret. I haven't manipulated data. It's all data in the public domain. Anyone else can do this, but it seems they'd rather not.
And you are being told by large numbers of people with very official titles that you're wrong.
Yes.
But you're not.
I don't think so.
We found no one on our travels around an oil-dependent world who thought it likely we'll be buying crude at $20 a barrel or petrol at 60 cents a litre ever again. No one denies either that the age of oil will ultimately end. What's in dispute is whether it will end decades hence with a whimper or soon, and as George Miller predicted, with a most uncomfortable bang.
You can discuss tonight's program with reporter Jonathan Holmes, along with MP Andrew McNamara